day in the neighborhood. The sun is shining, flowers are blossoming, snotty little kids waking up their parents. It's such a beautiful day. It's such a beautiful day. It's such a beautiful day in the neighborhood. The birds are chirping, lawnmowers cutting, barbecue burning, dead animals. It's such a beautiful day. It's such a beautiful day. It's such a fitting day. It's such a wonderful day. It's such a beautiful day. It's such a gorgeous day. It's such a happy day. It's such a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Oh, it's a beautiful day to impeach a bitch. A beautiful day to impeach a bitch.
Oh, you could call him Hood.
Huh?
The Hood. Beautiful day to impeach the Hood. Beautiful day to impeach the Hood.
Oh, won't you be my neighbor? So we're listening to the live impeachment testimony.
My ass woke up at like 5:30. It's like clockwork. Like I knew the hearings were starting at 6 a.m. our time, and I didn't set an alarm or anything like that. But I just naturally woke up at 5:30, and I was like, "Well, I'm already up. I might as well." Made some coffee, and I've just been watching it since 6 a.m. our time.
So they're interviewing Sondland now, who now now his memory was refreshed. He remembers a quid pro quo. It seems the Republican strategy is that since the Ukrainians never actually did the thing that Trump was trying to pressure them into doing, then it doesn't count. So it's like attempted coercion didn't work.
One thing that I thought was really striking about this whole thing is that Sondland kept emphasizing that it was more about the announcement of an investigation rather than actually doing an investigation. And they asked him, I forgot who was doing the questioning, but they asked him about it. They said, was he really concerned about the actual investigation? And Sondland said, no, it was more about announcing the investigation. So he doesn't care about corruption. First of all, he wouldn't ask Ukraine to look into corruption, first of all. But secondly, I don't even know how to put it. So yeah, he just doesn't care. He just wants them to go on camera on CNN and announce that there's an investigation, and then that already puts certain thoughts in people's minds, and he didn't care like what the results would be or what if there even was an election. He didn't care, and Sondland pretty much backed that. He said it was more about announcing the investigation than actually doing an investigation. Because they asked him, has anybody ever talked to you about investigating corruption? And he's like, no. So how much of now he's saying that's why he withheld the aid, because he was concerned about corruption, but that was never brought up to anybody. That's just, a talking point now that we can all agree with, because who likes corruption, right? So, but he didn't care. It was more about announcing.
All right. Should we listen to some of it here? Yeah. All right, let's see who's on first here. Okay, Mike Turner, Republican, Ohio's asking some questions now. Let me get the volume up.
Yesterday, Ambassador Volker, who I consider to be very talented and a man of integrity, and I believe you think he's a man of integrity, correct?
I do.
He testified that the President of the United States did not tie either a meeting with the President, a phone call, or any aid to investigations of Burisma 2016 or the Bidens. That the President did not do that. And you've testified that the President did not tell you that he tied them either, correct?
I did testify to that, although when Ambassador Volker and I were working on the statement and negotiating with the Ukrainians, it was clear to Ambassador Volker that a meeting would not happen without the Burisma in 2016. That was very clear to Ambassador Volker.
And how do you know that? What did he say to you? Because he says that was not clear to him. In fact, he says that's not the case. He was working on that. He knows that that's what the president wanted, but he didn't have it as this was a requirement.
Oh, I strongly disagree with that portion of his testimony. It was absolutely a requirement, or we would have just had the meeting and been done with it.
What about the aid? He says that they weren't tied, that the aid was not tied.
And I didn't say they were conclusively tied either. I said I was presuming it.
Okay, and so the president never told you they were tied. So your testimony, his testimony is consistent, and the president did not tie aid to investigations.
That's correct.
Okay, he also testified that he spoke to Giuliani and that Giuliani did not relate that he was tying on behalf of the president or on the president's behalf aid, and then in fact Giuliani never said to him that aid was tied to investigations. Now, the question I have for you is, did you ever have a conversation with Giuliani that did not involve Volker? Because your testimony is a lot of we's and us's. So do you and Giuliani have a separate phone call where Giuliani told you that the aid was tied? Because Volker says, and if he was on all your phone calls, Volker says that never happened.
No, I did have a few conversations. I don't recall how many because I don't have the records with Mr. Giuliani directly when Mr. Volker wasn't available.
And did Giuliani say to you, go ahead, what were you going to say?
I don't believe I testified that Mr. Giuliani told me that aid was tied.
Oh, I think, see, this is part of the problem, Ambassador Sondland, and I just want to walk you through this, is you've said to us everyone was in the loop, and everyone knew. Now, hold on a second. I've listened to you today, as a lot of people, and not only are your answers somewhat circular, frequently you've contradicted yourself in your own answer. Now, the text messages and emails that you put up there, Kurt Volker walked us through, and he has a completely different understanding of what you were saying than what you're saying you were saying. So I'm a little confused as to how everyone's in the loop, because if Giuliani didn't give you any express statement, then it can't be that you believe this from Giuliani. Now, let me tell you right now, because is Donald Trump your friend?
No, we're not friends.
Okay. Do you like the president?
Yes.
Okay. Well, after you testified, Chairman Schiff ran out and gave a press conference and said he gets to impeach the President of the United States because of your testimony. And if you pull up CNN today, right now, their banner says Sondland ties Trump to withholding aid. Is that your testimony today, Ambassador Sondland, that you have evidence that Donald Trump tied the investigations to the aid? Because I don't think you're saying that.
I've said repeatedly, Congressman, I was presuming. I also said that President Trump...
So no one told you, not just the president. Giuliani didn't tell you, Mulvaney didn't tell you, nobody, Pompeo didn't tell you, nobody else on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying aid to these investigations. Is that correct?
I think I already testified.
No, answer the question. Is it correct? No one on this planet told you that Donald Trump was tying this aid to the investigations? Because if your answer is yes, then the chairman's wrong and the headline on CNN is wrong. No one on this planet told you that President Trump was tying aid to investigations. Yes or no?
Yes.
So, you really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations?
Other than my own presumption.
Which is nothing. I mean, that's what I don't understand. So you know what hearsay evidence is, Ambassador? Hearsay is when I testify what someone else told me. Do you know what made-up testimony is? Made-up testimony is when I just presume it. I mean, you're just assuming all of these things, and then you're giving them the evidence that they're running out and doing press conferences, and CNN's headline is saying that you're saying the President of the United States should be impeached because he tied aid to investigations, and you don't know that, correct?
I never said the President of the United States should be impeached.
Nope, but you did. You have left people with the confusing impression that you were giving testimony that you did not. You do not have any evidence that the President of the United States was tied to withholding aid from Ukraine in exchange for investigations. I yield back.
Mr. Carson. Thank you, Chairman. Ambassador Sondland, I really want to better understand Mr. Giuliani's role in carrying out the President's demand for investigation. So On May the 23rd, sir, during a meeting in the Oval Office to discuss the future of
Andre Carson, Democrat from Indiana.
President Trump told you and others to, quote, talk to Rudy. Do I have that right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, did you listen to the president and talk to Rudy, sir?
Did I talk to Rudy?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What did you understand to be Mr. Giuliani's relationship with President Trump?
I understood he was the president's personal lawyer.
What did you believe to be Mr. Giuliani? What did you believe Mr. Giuliani was doing in Ukraine for President Trump, sir?
I don't know.
Ambassador Sondland, in August of this year, you and Ambassador Volker spoke with Mr. Giuliani about a draft statement to be issued by President Zelensky. During those discussions, it was Mr. Giuliani who suggested, in fact, insisted that the statement include specific language about Burisma. Correct, sir?
Correct.
And he insisted that the statement include the mention of the 2016 elections. And Mr. Volker transmitted this message to a top Ukrainian official, right, sir?
Correct.
Mr. Ambassador, and this statement was part of the deliverable that President Trump wanted, correct, sir?
Correct.
To your knowledge, sir, was pushing the Ukrainians to investigate Burisma 2016 on the Biden's part of some official State Department policy, sir?
I never testified that we were pushing anyone to investigate the Bidens. I said Burisma.
You were involved in Ukrainian policy, right, sir?
I told you what my role was, which was quite limited and focused.
Was it your understanding, Mr. Ambassador, that Ukraine policy should involve investigations into Americans or debunk conspiracy theories about the 2016 election, sir?
What I testified was that in order to get President Zelensky a White House visit, Mr. Giuliani conveyed the notion that President Trump wanted these announcements to happen.
Of course it was not. It was a part of the president's political agenda, and it was done to benefit the president personally and politically. Were you following the president's orders, Mr. Ambassador?
I was following the president's direction to speak with Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just
Ambassador Sondland's being interviewed still.
response to my colleagues.
Adam
Seem
Schiff.
to be under the impression that unless the president spoke the words, Ambassador Sondland, I am bribing the Ukrainian president, that there's no evidence of bribery. If he didn't say, Ambassador Sondland, I'm telling you I'm not going to give the aid unless they do this, that there's no evidence of a quid pro quo on military aid. But nonetheless, Ambassador, you've given us a lot of evidence of precisely that conditionality of both the White House meeting and the military assistance. You've told us, Ambassador, have you not, that you emailed the Secretary of State and said that if these investigations were announced, the new justice person was put in place, that the Ukrainians would be prepared to give the president what he wants, and that would break the logjam. You've testified and showed us documents about this, have you not, Ambassador?
I have.
And in your written statement, you say that the logjam you're referring to includes the logjam on security assistance, correct?
Correct. As my presumption.
Yes. And we also have seen, and you testified, that you have also seen Ambassador, or rather, Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney himself acknowledge that the military aid was withheld in part over the investigation into 2016 that you've talked about. You referenced that as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, they also seem to say that, well, they got the money. The money may have been conditioned, but they got the money. Yes, they got caught. They got caught. Now, they still don't have the White House meeting. They made no statement. They got no meeting. The statement on the investigations was the condition to get the meeting. They didn't make the statement. They got no meeting. But they got caught. You're aware, aren't you, Ambassador, that 2 days before the aid was lifted, this inexplicable aid was lifted, Congress announced it was investigating this scheme. You're aware of that, aren't you, Ambassador?
I am now, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address something, a claim that you made this morning, claiming that Republicans deny Russian attempts to influence
Brad
our
Winstrip,
elections.
Republican,
That is
Ohio.
false, and you know it. In this committee, the Intel Committee, not the Impeachment Committee, but in this committee, time and time again, we all agreed that Russia has tried to influence American elections as far back as the Soviet Union. So I wish you would quit making that comment. Yesterday, we established with Mr. Volker something quite obvious. More than one country can try to influence our elections. See, Mr. Schiff, we didn't agree with your Russian collusion narrative, your DNC Clinton campaign coup attempt that occurred in conjunction with members of the FBI and DOJ and foreign sources, something that you have conveniently ignored as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, as you became the chairman of the Impeachment Committee. But in this process today, I'm interested in facts. I'm not a prosecutor or a defense attorney. I'm not an attorney like Mr. Turner. Ambassador Sondland, you honestly have used the words presumed, presumption, presuming, some form of the verb to presume repeatedly today. And today you said that was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one ever told me the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was. You see, in mathematic fact, 2 plus 2 does equal 4. But in reality, 2 presumptions plus 2 presumptions does not equal even 1 fact. And the fact is, the president did tell you, Ambassador Sondland, no quid pro quo. That's a fact. And another fact, no quid pro quo occurred. This time I'd like to yield to Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to unanimously consent to enter into the record a Washington Post article from today that headline, Schiff's claim that the whistleblower has a statutory right to anonymity received 3 Pinocchios.
Republican, Texas, Mike Conway.
Well, we all know what Pinocchios mean. The interpretation of that would be that, or 2 interpretations. The one that my colleagues on the other side would argue is that we're trying to protect the whistleblower. An equally valid and credible interpretation is that there's something to hide, and that this unlevel playing field that's been created by the chairman's insistence that there is a statutory right to anonymity maintains that unlevel playing field and the advantages that gives them. Now, the chairman also announces at every hearing that he will not tolerate, and I agree with him, any witness intimidation, any threats, or any issues of trying to bully a witness. Ambassador Sondland, have you, your family, or your businesses received any threats or reprisals or attempts to harm you in any way?
Many.
Could you give us an example or 2?
We have countless emails, apparently, to my wife. Our properties are being picketed and boycotted.
Let's explore that one. Our own colleague, Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, has in fact called for a boycott of your hotel chain or your hotels in Oregon. I'm assuming he believes that will harm you to the point that you will then be bullied into doing whatever he wants done. Now, my colleagues and I know that using the word bully and Earl Blumenauer in the same sentence is a bit over the top. But nevertheless, he intended to harm you and your businesses. Is that what you would surmise?
That's my understanding.
And that the boycotts, his call for boycott gave rise to demonstrations in front of your hotels that made your customers have to weave in and out of the demonstrators to try to actually get into the hotels?
As I understand, they're going on as we speak.
Well, the words are better put by a couple of other Oregonians. It says, Congressman Blumenauer's irresponsible attempt to hurt a homegrown business that supports hundreds of jobs in our local economy is just shameful and ought to be an outrage to all Oregonians. Some fellow named McDermott. And then a lady named Ellen Carmichael, who I believe works for you, said, we are saddened to have our Congressman Earl Blumenauer call for a boycott that would put the livelihoods of thousands of his constituents in peril. The attack on our employees is unwarranted. And I couldn't agree more, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Blumenauer should not be using the vast influences that we as members of Congress have to bully you and your businesses and to harm the hundreds or thousands of employees that operate in your business by trying to take business away from you, to force you into doing something that they wanted you to do, which is actually testify, and you've actually done that. But that's a shame for that. And I'm hopeful that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will join me in saying, Mr. Blumenauer, you really shouldn't be using your congressional influence to try to bully and threaten a witness before these proceedings. That is just wrong. And I'm looking forward to my colleagues' response, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Ms. Spear.
I was somewhat humored by your request that Mr. Blumenauer not bully to get something done when all we're talking about is the president bullying to get something he wants done. But having said that, I'd like to clarify one point about the whistleblower protection from the article that Mr. Conway just provided. The law reads, expressly restricts the Inspector General's office from disclosing whistleblowers' identities. It says, quote, the Inspector General shall not disclose the identity of the employee without the consent of the employee unless the Inspector General determines that such disclosure is unavoidable during the course of the investigation or the disclosure is made to an official of the Department of Justice responsible for determining whether a prosecution should be undertaken. Unquote. That appears to be the lone statutory restriction on disclosing a whistleblower's identity, applicable only to the Inspector General's office. We found no court rulings on whether whistleblowers have a right to anonymity under the ICWPA or related statutes. Vladeck said it is nonetheless a best practice to avoid disclosure of the Ukraine whistleblower's identity, given the concerns about retaliation. McCulloch said, we've stepped into bizarro land when senior policymakers are trying to yank a CIA employee into the public spotlight in retaliation for making a whistleblowing complaint, especially when they are credible threats to that employee's personal safety. And I don't know why our colleagues on the other side of the aisle...
Does your lady yield?
No, I'm afraid I only have 3 minutes and I have some other issues, but thank you.
Well, the end of the article does go through that and also says it's 3 Pinocchios in spite of that conversation.
Well, the President of the United States has 5 Pinocchios on a daily basis, so let's not go there. Ambassador Sondland, in your deposition, you lamented, quote, I was truly disappointed that the State Department prevented me at the last minute from testifying earlier on October 8th, 2019. But your issuance of a subpoena has supported my appearance here today, and I'm pleased to provide the following testimony. So it is clear that the White House, the State Department, did not want you to testify at that deposition. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And since then, you have on numerous occasions during your opening statement today indicated that you have not been able to access documents in the State Department. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you have been hampered in your ability to provide testimony to this committee. Is that correct?
I've been hampered to provide completely accurate testimony without the benefit of those documents.
In terms of your conversations with the President of the United States, what percentage of your conversations were about Ukraine as compared to your other duties?
I don't recall.
Well, you've only had 6 conversations or 7 conversations with the President, you said. So
About Ukraine, I think.
So you've had many other conversations?
Oh, yeah, about completely unrelated matters.
So how many conversations with the President of the United States have you had?
Again, I don't want to give you a number because it's going to be wrong if I don't have the records.
Is it less than 20?
It's probably in that range.
All right. Would you say that delay in military aid and the lack of a meeting in the White House works to the benefit of Russia?
Repeat the question again, please.
Would you say that the delay in military aid to Ukraine and the reluctance to have a White House meeting has a benefit to Russia?
I think it could be looked at that way, yes.
All right, I'm going to just speak very briefly about code. When Michael Cohen was before the Oversight Committee, he was asked, you suggest the president sometimes communicates his wishes indirectly. For example, you say, quote, Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. It would be different, he said, he doesn't give you questions. He doesn't give you orders. He speaks in code. And I understand the code because I've been around him for a decade. So do you think that the president was speaking in code when he would talk about wanting investigations?
I can't characterize how the president was speaking. Every conversation I've had with the president has been fairly direct and straightforward.
All right, with that I yield back.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Beautiful world listening to the impeachment for, God, I don't know, maybe another half hour.
Press Secretary Ambassador Sondland's testimony today misrepresented both
Chris Stewart, Representative, Republican, Utah.
Direction the Secretary received from President Trump. As previously stated, Secretary Perry spoke to Rudy Giuliani only once at the President's request. No one else was on that call. At no point before, during, or after the phone call did the words Biden or Burisma ever come up in the presence of Secretary Perry. Again, I ask that that be entered into the record.
Without objection, although I would note that they've also refused to come and testify under oath.
The American people expect a lot of things out of politics. Arguments, protests, we certainly see that. Clash of principles and ideas. I think sometimes eventually they actually would like to see some compromise. But I think something they expect above everything else, fundamental, they expect that there is a sense of fairness about it. And I want to read part of a text I received from someone that I have tremendous respect for. Just a few hours ago, she wrote, "Crafting a story to hurt another human being can never be right. The means of destroying and hurting another individual just does not justify the end, and politics does not give anyone free pass to destroy other people." Now, you can say a lot about the treatment of President Trump over the last 3 years, but I think one thing you cannot argue is that it has been fair. There were those calling for his impeachment literally before he was inaugurated. For 2.5 years, we were told every single day he has betrayed our country. He is a Russian asset. He has committed treason. Accusations that we know now are not true, and for which we never had any evidence to support that. He was accused of obstruction, and now here we are actually impeaching the president over, well, first, quid pro quo, until we found out that didn't hold very well with focus groups, and then it was bribery, until virtually every witness before us who was asked the question said they had no evidence of bribery, and now it's extortion. And again, the American people expect some sense of fairness. So when Nancy Pelosi goes before she has seen a shred of evidence, and she announces the president has betrayed his oath of office, he has betrayed the American people, he betrayed national security, without seeing any evidence, again, the American people say, well, what is fair about that? So the question before us now is, again, extortion.
Hold on. The American people say that?
Say what?
No, I say that we already knew that he was guilty because Giuliani and Trump admitted everything before.
And so did Mulvaney. Remember, he was like, yeah, there's a quid pro quo, get over it.
But before we got the memo, they already knew what Trump did because he admitted it, and so did Giuliani.
Yeah.
So that's why they announced the impeachment hearings. So I had to interject.
Complete investigation of corruption, which inhibited the interaction with Ukraine and the USA. Does that sound like President Zelensky is being bribed or extorted in that comment?
As I testified previously, I'm not a lawyer either, and I don't want to characterize any legal terms. I really don't.
That's fine. I think most people would read that and say that doesn't sound like he's under severe pressure. He makes it very clear in his own words then. Ukrainian President Zelensky told reporters during a joint press conference with Donald Trump that he was not pressured by the U.S. president. Again, I was not pressured. He used another time. There was no blackmail. I would ask you, do you think he felt like he was being extorted by the president based on these comments?
I really think that's for the committee and the Congress to...
Well, you know what, Mr. Ambassador? It's really for the American people.
I agree.
And the American people aren't stupid. And the American people can hear that, and they can say, I don't think he was under duress. I don't think he was being extorted. I don't think there was an exchange of a bribe. And I would conclude with this last observation.
We're the American people. I think he was bribed. I think he was pressured. I think they had him over a barrel because Russia's invading. So, bullshit.
We will withhold aid for various reasons.
That's correct.
It is a policy. I mean, for example, President Bush did it. He suspended military aid to 35 countries. over their lack of support for the International Criminal Court. I'll bet that helped his political standing back home. But I don't remember anyone suggesting we should impeach him for it. President Trump did it last year with Afghanistan over corruption. We did it with Pakistan over much the same thing, and no one suggested that we impeach them for it. This is a common occurrence in international relations. It is hardly an impeachable offense.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for being here today. You know, there are things we can agree with our colleagues on, things we can disagree. I can agree that with my colleague that we should turn over all the documents should be turned over. Mr. Ambassador, I think you agree that it would have helped your testimony, helped you understood that the State Department, the White House hasn't turned over a single document. The White House won the President's April phone conversation, but millions more out there. So on that we can agree. On others we can disagree as to, particularly as it relates to the whistleblower. It distresses me because I begin to wonder about the motivations. In the final analysis, the way I look at this is if we were investigating an arson, you all would indict the person who pulled the fire alarm. That person's job is done, and we've seen the smoke and we've seen the fire. Whatever the whistleblower did doesn't change the president's actions, doesn't change the president's own words, which are in our testimony, are in our body of evidence. It doesn't change Mr. Mulvaney's own words. It doesn't change the body of evidence here. All it does is put this person at risk. Back to the documents and what you know, and clearly, Mr. Ambassador, you seem to have your memory jogged by documents. Let's talk about May 23rd and see if this one helps you. Senator Johnson, in referencing the May 23rd meeting in his letter, sir, says, I have no recollection of the president saying that during the meeting. It is entirely possible he did because I do not work for the president. If made, the comment simply did not register with me. He also says, I also remember Sondland staying behind to talk to the president as the rest of the delegation left the Oval Office. Sir, do you recall this later conversation and what you and the president discussed?
I do.
And what was that?
Just again recapping what it was, sort of a free-for-all conversation, and I wanted to tie down exactly what we agreed to do and what we didn't.
And in that subsequent, he reinforced, talk to Rudy. And
talk to Rudy. You guys should work on this.
Did he go into any more detail about what that meant?
No.
Just said, talk to Rudy.
It was a very short conversation.
And the second part, you said there was something besides just talk to Rudy?
Yeah, to reconfirm that the three of us would be working on the Ukraine file.
Yeah, and
so on.
Back to Rudy in this seemingly contradictory messages here. You now recall the prerequisite mentioned in the July 10th meeting, right? That when you were having this discussion, the first meeting in John Bolton's office, sir,
yes,
you referenced that there was a condition.
I believe someone else testified that I raised that, and I didn't dispute that testimony, that I said it's my understanding that in order to get this visit done, there needs to be an announcement about, I don't know if I said investigation.
But he's saying something different. He's saying it's not going
Whoops.
to happen. There's no notice.
I think that's better.
In any way.
Well, that was Ambassador Volker's point. this was really an exchange with Ambassador Taylor
Correct.
and Ambassador Volker. Ambassador Volker is saying, don't let other people speak for the U.S. government. That was his point.
But if Rudy is following the directions and he's saying what he's saying here, and you're also following directions, right? And you're saying it's conditioned, who's giving you the instructions to say what you're saying?
That's why we thought it was problematic to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Exactly. But who did you work with to say the things that you said? Did you have conversations with the chief of staff, with Secretary Pompeo, to say what you were saying? You didn't just say this on your own.
Are you talking about in the July 10th meeting?
That's correct.
Oh, yeah, with Ambassador Volker, because at that point, Ambassador Volker was the one in touch with Mr. Giuliani, not me.
But you had no direct conversations with Mr. Mulvaney about this or Secretary Pompeo to make this condition statement?
Only the texts and emails that I've already reviewed.
Thank you. My time is up.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Ambassador Sondland, for your service. And I also want to thank you for your recognition in your opening statement of your hardworking staff at the U.S. mission to the EU. Mr. Sondland,
Elsie Stefanik, Republican Intelligence Committee.
Direct confirmation or specific information as to why there was a hold on aid.
That's correct.
And in fact, you testified, quote, President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, end quote.
That's correct.
You said, quote, never heard those words from the president, correct?
Correct.
Instead, you testified that in your September 9th call with President Trump, the president said, quote, no quid pro quo. I want nothing. I want nothing. I want President Zelensky to do the right thing, do what he ran on, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the fact is, the aid was given to Ukraine without any announcement of new investigations.
That's correct.
And President Trump did, in fact, meet with President Zelensky in September at the United Nations, correct?
We did.
And there was no announcement of investigations before this meeting?
Correct.
And there was no announcement of investigations after this meeting?
That's right.
And you've been very clear when Chairman Schiff has asked you broadly about investigations. You've corrected that to say specifically your understanding of investigations are investigation into the 2016 elections and investigations into Burisma. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And are you aware that during the Obama administration, the U.S. partnered with the UK and Ukraine on an investigation into the owner of Burisma as part of Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts?
I became aware of it today during the hearing.
Other witnesses have testified, but yes. And in fact, the Obama administration State Department was concerned about the potential appearance of conflict of interest with Hunter Biden serving on the board of Burisma because they raised this as they were preparing Ambassador Yovanovitch for her Senate confirmation. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of it.
She testified in the open hearing and the closed deposition. And I've asked most of our witnesses this, and every witness I've asked has said yes, and I want to ask you this today. Do you believe that Hunter Biden having a position on the board of Burisma has the potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
I don't want to characterize Hunter Biden's service on the board one way or another. I just don't know enough.
So you disagree with every other witness that has answered yes, there is a potential appearance of a conflict of interest?
Well, you asked if there was a conflict or an appearance of
potential. My quote was the potential appearance of a conflict of interest.
I didn't hear the word appearance. Well, clearly it's an appearance of a conflict.
Correct. Clearly it is an appearance of conflict of interest. Again, this is something that every witness has answered yes to or agreed with it could have a potential appearance, and yet we are not allowed to call Hunter Biden to answer questions in front of this committee. Thank you again for your truthful testimony today, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Hunter Biden's not being impeached. Nothing to do with it.
Nothing to do with anything.
Sondland's. Oh, he's talking to Fartman. Eric Swaywell. Fartman. The Democrat Intelligence Committee, the Fartgate guy.
Just a couple hours ago, President Trump was asked about you, and he said, I don't know him well. I have not spoken to him much. This is not a man I know well. Is that true?
It really depends on what you mean by know well. We are not close friends. No, we have a professional, cordial working relationship.
And in that working relationship, he knows who you are?
Yes.
And he has spoken to you often?
What's often?
Well, you said at least 20 times.
Okay, if that's often, then it's often.
And you donated $1 million to his inaugural committee, is that right?
I bought a VVIP ticket to the inauguration.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
It's a lot of money.
And after that, the president makes you ambassador to the European Union. Eventually, the ambassador to Ukraine is removed, and as you told us in your deposition, you become a central figure as it relates to Ukraine. That's a pretty big responsibility, right?
Well, I don't know that I said I was a central figure. I was one of several people who were tasked to work on the Ukraine file.
And would you ever, in that big responsibility, take any actions that were not authorized by President Trump?
By President Trump or leadership of the State Department.
Were you ever hauled into the leadership of the State Department for any actions you had taken around your work on Ukraine?
No.
As to Rudy Giuliani, on May 23rd, the president told you, talk to Rudy. You talked to him a couple times. As you told us in September, talked to the president a couple times. Did the president ever say to you, stop talking to Rudy?
No.
Did he ever say, don't any longer talk to Rudy?
No.
On Ukraine, you said that you were playing the hand you were dealt. President Trump was the dealer, wasn't he?
President Trump was what?
The dealer. In your metaphor, you were playing the hand you were dealt. The dealer is President Trump, is that right?
I'll recharacterize your question by saying we followed the direction of the president because that was the only pathway to working with Ukraine.
On page 4 of your testimony, you said, given what we knew at the time, what we were asked to do did not appear to be wrong. And you would agree now, Ambassador, knowing what you know now, what you did not know at the time, there are some things around Ukraine that were wrong.
I agree.
So let's take out any leveraging of security assistance over the Ukrainians and a White House visit. Would you agree that it is wrong for the President of the United States to ask the leader of a foreign government to investigate the President of the United States' political opponent?
Yes.
Would you agree that in addition to making that request for an investigation, leveraging a visit at the White House that a foreign government leader desperately needs is also wrong?
Leveraging in what respect?
A meeting at the White House. If someone really needs a meeting at the White House to show their legitimacy to their people, that leveraging that meeting and asking for an investigation would be wrong.
Well, to be candid, Congressman, every meeting at the White House has conditions placed on it. I've never worked on a meeting at the White House that doesn't have a host of conditions placed.
But if one of those conditions is to investigate a political opponent, you would agree that would be wrong?
The political opponent, yes. But making announcements or investigations per se, no.
And if you asked a foreign government leader to investigate your political opponent, leveraged a White House meeting, and leveraged security assistance, in this hypothetical, you would agree all three of those are wrong?
In the hypothetical, yes, I would agree.
Now, you, before becoming an ambassador, worked as a businessman, and I presume you worked on a lot of deals, is that right?
Correct.
Involving millions of dollars?
Correct.
You work for a guy now who wrote a book called Art of the Deal, is that right?
I do.
And State Department employees have told us that they don't want to make legal definitions around what occurred with the White House meeting being leveraged against the investigations, but you plainly call it a quid pro quo, is that right?
I did.
And finally, one final hypothetical. If someone walks through those two doors wearing rain boots, a raincoat, and holding an umbrella with raindrops falling off of them, do you have to see outside that it's raining to presume or conclude that it might be raining outside?
I understand your hypothetical.
I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Hurd. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
My colleague from California basically implied that you've been supportive of President Trump's campaign. Is that correct?
I'm having a very hard time hearing you, sir.
My colleague from California indicated that you were supportive of the president's campaign. Is that correct?
I actually donated to the inaugural committee in order to secure tickets.
So let me ask this question. Did you participate in or overhear any conversations about the potential information collected by Ukraine on the Bidens, collected by Ukrainians on the Bidens, would be used for political gain?
Did I personally hear that? No.
Did you participate in any conversations when this was being discussed?
Not that I recall.
In your statement on page 5, you said Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Then you also recounted your conversation with President Trump where he says, I want nothing, no quid pro quo. How do you reconcile these two statements?
They're hard to reconcile. We were working along Mr. Giuliani's direction for a period of time. We still didn't have a White House meeting. Aid was now held up. There were lots of reasons being given by various people as to why those weren't moving forward. And I finally got exasperated by receiving Ambassador Taylor's latest text, and I just picked up the phone. I got through the president and I said, what do you want?
Sure. Are you aware of any specific conversations Mayor Giuliani had with the president between your May 23rd conversation and September 11th, 2019? I
don't recall if Mayor Giuliani, when I was directly talking to him, either through a conference call or on a direct call, whether he quoted from the president or said, I just talked to the president. Most of the communications, as I said, went through Ambassador Volker initially. So I don't want to opine on what may or may not have been said.
On page 11 of your testimony, you said Mr. Giuliani had been communicating with Ukrainians without our knowledge. I'm assuming you're believing you Mr. Volker, and Ambassador Taylor. Which Ukrainians was Rudy Giuliani communicating with?
Well, I was specifically referring to this text that I received from Ambassador Volker, where Mr. Giuliani was apparently telling the Ukrainians something that frustrated Ambassador Volker.
Sure. So who specifically? Right. We know that
Mr. Lutsenko, the old prosecutor.
And do you think Mr. Lutsenko has any gravitas within the Zelensky regime?
I don't know. He was the old attorney general and
ultimately got fired in August when the new group came in. Okay, so we know Rudy Giuliani has met with Mr. Yermak on the fringes of meetings in, I think it was Spain. Do you know any other Ukrainian official within the Zelensky regime that Mayor Giuliani was meeting with?
I don't know who Mr. Giuliani was meeting with.
Had you had any conversations with Ukrainian officials within the Zelensky regime that came to you and said, hey, I just got off the phone with Giuliani, what the hell is he talking about?
I don't recall.
Would that be normal? In all your interactions with ambassadors and heads of states and governments, if there is some element of the U.S. government that they have spoken to, isn't it usually the step that they come in, talk to the ambassador, try to clarify what that statement was? Is that a true characterization of how elements of diplomacy work?
I think that's a reasonable possibility. Things work all kinds of different ways these days.
When you met with President Zelensky after the July 25th phone call, so you met him on July 26th, did the investigations or Joe Biden come up in that meeting?
I don't recall Joe Biden coming up.
Was there any frustration expressed to you by the phone call that happened the day before?
No, as I testified, everyone said it was a good call.
Is, in your opinion, your interactions with President Zelensky, is he a straight shooter? Is he a liar? Or is he a liar?
He impressed me greatly, and that's why I wanted to get he and President Trump together as soon as possible.
And so when he makes express statements, you tend to believe them?
Yeah, with my limited interaction with him, he seems very...
Well, wasn't that fun, kids? Let's see, we're gonna be leaving in just a minute here. It's been a beautiful day.
It's raining.
We'll go listen to the impeachment hearings in the car on the way to where we gotta go. It's a beautiful day, and maybe it's raining where you are. Check it out. Check out the impeachment thing. It's just a drama that just keeps on going, and it's almost funny sometimes. Let's see. We will. Should we close out with the Widdershins song?
Yeah.
Because I want to hear the Widdershins song. Yeah. Let's see. Well, I guess we're going to see him tomorrow? Yeah. And we're going to see you tomorrow. Or hear you. Or you'll hear us. It's a beautiful day.
Widdershins, Widdershins.